Father in heaven, we thank Thee, Lord, once again that we can be together for this class. We thank Thee for the homeschool effort that the children can learn, that they can understand and have wisdom and knowledge pertaining to various subjects and now history. I pray, Lord, that Thou wouldst help us, that everything we learn we could somehow use to the glory of Thy kingdom. I pray that Thou wouldst give us wisdom and knowledge, and we give Thee thanks in return. I pray that Thou wouldst be with us, that Thou wouldst drive out every wicked spirit that would hinder us. Help us now, I pray, as we look at history, to see Thy hand and Thy glory, and know that Thy coming is at hand. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, what I'd like to start out with is I'd like to read a short portion of Scripture. Now, we're talking about World War II. We're going to move from World War I into World War II. We're going to talk a little bit about the time between those two wars and then go right into World War II. And I think you'll find this very interesting. Now, Brother Mick here would remember a lot more about World War II because he actually was alive during that time. I was born 5 years after it ended. I had a couple of uncles that were in the war. Both of them were injured in the war. One in the European theater and one in the Pacific theater. See, we don't have wars, we have theaters of wars. No, they did call them that. Depending on what location geographically the war was fought in, it was called a theater. Okay? But anyway, I knew a lot of veterans when I was growing up as a young boy in the 1950s. Of course, that was just after the war because it ended in 1945. I was born in 1950. So I was acquainted with a lot of the veterans, talked with a lot of them, my own relatives. I learned a lot about World War II just from that. So also there were still a lot of newsreels and a lot of programs on about World War II because it was so fresh in people's minds. So you heard a lot about it back in those days. And now people know precious little about it. It isn't taught much anymore. They kind of skim over it, and they make the United States look awful compared to other countries, that we did these awful things to the Japanese and did these awful things to the other people, indigenous people around the world. And it's all distorted and twisted. Now, the United States had its problems. It did make some major mistakes and did some awful things. That is true, but every nation did. War is an awful, terrible thing. And what we're going to do is, by the way, what the United States did and what other nations in the Allied realm did is very, very small comparatively as far as atrocities to what some of the, I call them raving maniacs, on the Axis side were doing. But anyway, I just want you to understand that there was trouble on every hand. That's the way war is. Now, it tells us in James chapter 4, in the first verse, "From whence come wars and fightings among you?" That's a good question, isn't it? Where do wars and fightings come from? Why would a whole world engage in a war? All these people take up arms and start killing each other and planning out ways to destroy and to bomb and to just make a big mess of everything and obliterate everything. Why would that happen? Well, the Bible gives you the answer. "Come they not hence even of your lusts, that war in your members?" Now, there are lusts that can war in people's members. And the Bible says we are not to lust regarding anything. Lust is always wrong, whether it be money or sexual things or power or any of these things. When you have a lust, it has to be dealt with, or it'll be like a weed patch. It'll grow way out of proportion and can eventually strangle your entire life. So you want to always guard against any kind of lust. There are some things that are good, godly desires, but it's the devil's job to make sure that things are distorted and that perverted and that you develop lust for evil things. And that's what happens, and that's what causes war. And of course, we have a man we're going to talk about named Adolf Hitler, who is dead now, and I don't doubt that I think I know where he went. I don't hear anything about where he ever repented, and what a repentance that would have to be anyway. But he knows better now. He knows there's a God in heaven. And the same holds true for a lot of other people that lived back then. Benito Mussolini and some of the Japanese people that did these terrible things. But the point is that they did have lusts. Hitler had a lust for power. He had a sadistic lust to kill. Very strange individual, because even though people who knew him thought he was a mild-mannered, meek character, yet he'd get up and something would come over him when he'd make his speeches. And he would be a magnetism would kind of engulf him. And people would listen, and he would get them stirred up into a frenzy. I don't know if you've ever seen any of those films with the thousands and thousands of people saluting him and yelling out, because he rallied them all together. More about that later. But he had some lusts that he had developed, and various ones. And that's what can happen. Also in the book of James, we know that the Bible says the tongue is a little member, but yet it sets on fire the whole course of the world, and is set on fire of hell. And if you look at what these dictators did with their tongues, you can certainly see how that would come about. So it says, "Come they not hence even of your lusts that war in your members? Ye lust and have not." It's an important point, because when you lust, you will never satisfy it. That's the great myth. People think if they have a lust, they can somehow satisfy it, but lust can't be satisfied. A good example of that is in a relationship between a man and a woman. If there's real godly love there, it'll be enduring, it'll last, it'll be good, it'll be blessed, everything's fine. But if there is a lust involved, there is never any satisfaction at all, and they develop what's called the wandering eye. See, because lust can't be satisfied. The Bible says right here, "You lust and have not." The lust precedes it, and have not it's a guaranteed thing. It's like drinking salt water. You always want more, and there's no way out of it if that's all you have. "Ye kill and desire to have, and cannot obtain." There you go again. You can never get it. "Ye fight and war, yet ye have not, because ye ask not." People have been looking in all the wrong places. Instead of gimme, gimme, and take, they should yield up their lust, get rid of it, and look to the Lord for what they need, and He will take care of all of us. He says, "Ye ask and receive not, because ye ask amiss, that ye may consume it upon your lusts." God will never answer a prayer that will somehow be used to feed a lust. Again, I say, because a lust can't be satisfied, and everything that the Lord gives you will satisfy. So you can't have an answer to prayer that'll be consumed upon a lust. God will never do that. Okay? There's quite a few little laws in that first part of James, isn't there? Aren't there? Then he says, "Ye adulterers and adulteresses, know ye not that the friendship of the world is enmity with God? Whosoever therefore will be a friend of the world is the enemy of God." And that is what I wanted to read for your consideration, because we will be dealing with this. The subject of what makes people do such terrible, terrible, terrible things. And it is lust. Usually when people think of lust, they think that it's just regarding sexual type things, but lust can be a lot of things, and for a lot of things. I'm going to turn the overhead projector on, and this is where we really ended up last time. This map that you see on the overhead projector is a map of World War I. And we went through World War I quite comprehensively last week. I understand from what I was told there was a lot of information in last week's lesson. But here you see the border. Here's Germany over here, these planes flying around. And here are some of the battles, some of the fronts that were in World War I. World War I ended in 1918. So here you can see some of the fronts from World War I, and as I said, it ended in 1918. Now, when the war ended, a treaty was drawn up. And the treaty was drawn up at a place called Versailles. Now, Versailles, of course, was the French palace. And all the different sides gathered together there. Germany surrendered, and a number of conditions were laid upon Germany. That one of the conditions of their surrender was that they could have a very small army. Okay, only just basically border guards. And that was strictly imposed on them. Another thing is the government that was set up was to be controlled by the winning sides. Do you remember who the winning sides were? Who were some of those in World War I on the winning side? England, France, the United States, which managed to get itself into the war, right? Okay, who lost, really? Germany, Austria-Hungary, which of course was, they were all pretty much the same thing. They were all in the same empire, you might say. So, Germany found itself with a government, a new government now, called the Weimar Republic, or the Germans would say Weimar. The Weimar Republic was set up specifically to keep Germany in check, to keep anybody from ever rising up. There would be no more Kaiser, okay? There would be a chancellor of Germany, but he had to really watch his P's and Q's. The money in Germany was in the hands of a banking house, the House of Rothschild. That basically didn't change, okay? But the German government found itself really strapped because their money was controlled by a central bank that was controlled from elsewhere, not within Germany itself. And this, of course, supplied Hitler later with a lot of fuel for rabble-rousing, saying it's the Jews that have all the money and they're destroying Germany. It's the Jews that caused the hyperinflation. And he got the people all stirred up about that. Well, anyway, after drawing up the Versailles Treaty and laying all kinds of restrictions on Germany, if you recall, I mentioned how Lloyd George, the representative from England, came from the Versailles Treaty, and the news media was there, and they asked him what was accomplished at the Versailles Treaty. He said, war in 20 years. That was 1918. In 1938, 20 years later, a man by the name of Hitler was already sending his military machine toward Poland. Actually, 1939 is when the attack was. But he was already marshaling his forces. So, that's a pretty accurate prediction by Lloyd George, isn't it, of England? 20 years. In other words, the Versailles Treaty would guarantee there would be another war. We usually think of a treaty as something that would end a war and, pretty much put the cap on it. Put a cork on it, put a lid on it, seal it off. When in reality, a treaty is a design for the next war. So when you hear about UN treaties, it's a design for a war. That's why with all the UN treaties we've ever had, there's always been a war that followed. In fact, the UN, since its inception, now this has changed recently because there are 40 wars going on right now. We'll get into current events in the last lesson. But up until 1972, I believe it was, there were 156 significant wars started by the UN through treaties, which was an organization guaranteed to ensure everlasting peace. So when you have a treaty, watch out. There's a war coming. Most people don't know that, do they? They think a treaty is a wonderful thing. Well, history tells us differently. Okay, so, question? They made it absolutely impossible for Germany to ever rise again as a power at the Versailles Treaty. They made it impossible. But, so it looked. But they found a way, didn't they? Okay? Well, the problem with World War I is it was a disappointment even to the conspirators because it didn't produce a League of Nations with the United States in it. What happened is that Woodrow Wilson was pushing for the United States to be in something called a League of Nations, a forerunner of the UN. All the nations jumped on that bandwagon, but in the United States, there was still a great deal of nationalistic pride. There wasn't a one-world way of thinking. The press wasn't fully welded to illuminism yet. It is now. But at that time, they hadn't gained full control of it. And when they got to the Senate was considering approving the treaty and the United States entering into the League of Nations at the end of World War I. But there was one man who stood up and gave a rousing speech. And that rousing speech in the Senate torpedoed the whole thing and kept the United States out of the League of Nations. Anybody want to guess, or do you think you know who it was at the end of World War I that gave that rousing speech and converted the whole Senate away from the League of Nations? It's a name you've heard before. It's a prominent name. I think I'll just tell you. It was Henry Cabot Lodge. Now, let me warn you about something. Later on, during the Nixon administration, there was a man who called himself Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. He had changed his name. He was not the son of Henry Cabot Lodge. He was exposed as a phony baloney. Okay? But he used the name Henry Cabot Lodge because it was very well respected. So, that stopped the League of Nations. The conspirators had to have another war because they felt that if another war, even more horrifying than the First World War, would be fought, this would have to be such a terrible war that it would definitely bring about a League of Nations or a United Nations. Did it? In 1945, the United Nations Treaty was brought from San Francisco, of all places, from the Bay Area, where it was drawn up by a man named Alger Hiss, a communist. And by the way, the United Nations Charter was copied word for word from the Soviet Constitution. How do you like them apples? So they had to have another war. How were they going to produce another war? The world was basically at peace. There were little internal disturbances in countries. Even in Germany, there was this impecunious, meaning poor, Austrian house painter who was rabble-rousing a little bit in the beer halls in the Munich, Germany area. Munich, of course, in German is pronounced München. And he'd go into the beer halls, and these guys had all gathered together, these drunken Germans, these old veterans from World War I. They were still fighting the war in their mind because they felt like they were sold down the river. So they'd get their big beer steins out, and they would be singing and waving their, you know how Germans will do that, wave their beer stein. In München steht ein Hofbrauhaus, ein, zwei, saufer. And they'd be in there and I'm just doing that for a little effect here for you, see? So anyway, they would, I can sing some more for you if you want me to. No, but anyway, maybe I will later. We'll see how it goes. What's that? Well, I don't know. I'm just teaching here. I'm not imbibing myself, nor am I involved in it. But anyway, so that they would be waving their beer steins and drinking. They'd get to the point where they were feeling single and seeing double and not quite coherent, and then Hitler would stand up, and they listened to him. Why would they listen to this man who didn't have any money? He ate maybe 3 times a week because he was so poor. Why would they listen to this little clown with a little beard under his nose called a mustache, called a Schnurrbart? That's what the Germans called it. A little shaved off, little square beard under the beard. Pardon me. The reason, you know why I keep saying beard? Because beard, the German word for beard is Bart. Schnurrbart is a mustache, and this was a particular type referred to as a Schnurrbart. So anyway, why would they listen to this little guy? He certainly didn't have much influence, did he? you think you know, Jane? Where did he get his great power from? Why did they listen to him? All these Germans. He had something around his neck called an iron cross. It was a beautiful blue ribbon worn around the neck, and sometimes he wore it on, later on he wore it on his jacket. But it was a black Maltese cross. It was the medal for bravery. It had never been given to an enlisted man. Only officers had ever won the Iron Cross. Adolf Hitler was the only enlisted man to ever win an Iron Cross, and he was highly respected for it because he was a war hero. He was only a corporal, but he was a war hero, and so they listened to him. And what did he talk about? He wasn't ranting against the Jews at this time. His beef was, and the noise he was making was, we must restore the might of the German soldiery. He was saying the German people are a master race, Meistermensch. The German people are blonde, blue-eyed supermen. And we can't allow the vermin from foreign shores to keep us down. He would hit the people with what they wanted to hear. Most of the people were broke. Inflation was running rampant. They had what was called hyperinflation in Germany. If you went to a restaurant, you used to have to argue with the restaurant to let you pay in advance, because by the time you finished your meal, the price sometimes had doubled. How would you like to go out to Ponderosa and go in there, and of course you always pay in advance there, but if they didn't do it that way, how would you like to have to argue with them? Because by the time you finished eating, instead of the $5 for the salad bar or whatever it is, it would be 10. And the next time you went, it would be 20, and would go up to 40 by the time you finished. So you could see where there's all kinds of trouble. It really did increase that fast. When people got paid money, you would take that money to the bank. They couldn't print it fast enough because it was inflating so fast. You take it to the bank, they'd rubber stamp the bigger amount right across the paper. Shelley? Yeah, they were engineering that. That's right. Because what was happening is the way to cause inflation is put more money into the economy than the economy has goods and services and anything of material substance to back up. If you have a glut of paper with nothing backing it up, then you've got more paper chasing after the same goods, don't you? If you've got, how can I illustrate this? If you've got a bushel of apples, okay, and you're selling these apples, well, what happens if you suddenly print a whole bunch of money? Those apples aren't worth as much anymore, really, because the money isn't worth as much anymore. You've got so much of it. You just turn on the presses, turn on the money pumps, and away it goes. And you print, and that brings down the value of everything. A lot of paper, not worth very much. So one thing about paper is it has to be regulated very strictly. So they had hyperinflation in Germany, and these people listened to Hitler. Now Hitler began to get up and make big speeches, not only in Munich, not only in Oberammergau, but he began to go into the Frankfurt area and Berlin, and he began to make speeches, rabble-rousing speeches. He also began to clash with another group called the Spartacus movement. The Spartacus movement was communist. They wore black uniforms. And he got into some tussles with them. Anyway, the chancellor in Germany at that time was a man named Paul von Hindenburg. Hindenburg and the government didn't want any more wars, and they didn't want trouble in Germany. So they arrested Hitler and put him in jail. They should have left him there. But they arrested him, they put him in jail. While he was in jail, a book was published. Now, Hitler didn't write it. Goering and Rudolf Hess, Hermann Goering and Rudolf Hess, wrote a book called Mein Kampf. The word Kampf means struggle. my struggle or my battle. This was written and the authorship was attributed to Hitler, and somehow tens of thousands of copies of these books got printed. Hitler had no money, but they got printed. Publication was complete, and the books were widespread throughout Germany, and nobody knows who financed it or how people got these books. We know now how it happened. It was the House of Rothschild who wanted another war, and they figured they would use this little clown who had a certain kind of magnetism, and if properly groomed and financed, could find his way into government and eventually become the dictator of the country, which he did. Once these books were out there, and what did Mein Kampf say? Hitler talked about himself as being a war hero and how he fought for Germany, but he fought for a Germany that was now destitute, that was now destroyed and ruined, that the people were progressive, the wealth was there, the potential was there, but these other elements were holding the German people down. So all the emotions of the German people were stirred up to the extent they were ready to listen to him. Then, in an election, he was, and through other pressures, he ended up, to make a long story short, as Prime Minister of Germany. Then when Hindenburg died, Hitler took his place and stepped into the role of dictator, and nobody really stopped him. See, the Weimar Republic was very weak. It was designed to be weak, to keep Germany weak. But Hitler, and it's a long story how he rose into power. But suddenly he had all kinds of money. No visible means of support, but a lot of money. Suddenly he had brown shirt uniforms for all of his followers. He began to build an army. They began to rabble-rouse in the streets and beat up Jews and blame them. And where did he get all these uniforms from? Somebody was supplying this guy. Okay? Oh, incidentally, Hitler used to be referred to as Schicklgruber. Did you ever hear that? They called him Old Schicklgruber. They said that was his real name. No, it wasn't his real name. Okay, his real name was Hitler. But his father, Hitler's father, was the illegitimate child of a woman named Schicklgruber, who was a Rothschild mistress. You know what that means? Hitler himself was at least one quarter Jewish, and actually was a Rothschild, part Rothschild himself. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? But that's why they called him Schicklgruber. So he rose to prominence. Then he turned on what he did is, of course, he confiscated the wealth that the Jews had. He gathered them into concentration camps, confiscated all that they had, began to bring the factories in Germany up to capacity, and all the way along, they would say from north to south along the Rhine River, the Ruhr region of the Rhine River, for 30, 40, and 50 miles running, you would see the steel mills, the Krupp-owned steel mills. All night long, of course, the hot metal, the flames rising into the air as they were producing all of these weapons. In the Ruhr-Rhine area, they produced a steel superior to any other steel in the world, and people wondered. The Germans are very intelligent, very industrious people. They always have been. And of course, if you can harness that for the enemy, you can really have a problem. That's why they were winning everywhere at the beginning of the war. Nobody could stop them. The plate armor on their tanks was twice the strength of any other tanks, including the Sherman tank of the United States. They had superior weapons all the way through. Everything they had was superior. And it's just because they put a lot of ingenuity into it, a lot of engineering into it. So that's why they had such success. Hitler, of course, realized he had to weld the people behind him. So to do so, he would have numerous speeches that he would make, with many, many thousands of people gathered to hear him. His salute was the right hand lifted up. Of course, one of the things he did, and it was Heil Hitler, okay? Sieg Heil. Sieg means victory. S-I-E-G. The G in German, a G on the end of a word is pronounced like a K. Sieg Heil. So he'd have one of his cronies there saying, Sieg! And everybody go, Heil! Over and over and over and over. Hail victory. Okay? There you see him with his upraised hand. That's Reichsparteitag, 1927 in Nuremberg. Okay, in other words, that is the celebration, the anniversary of the, see, the word Reich in German means rich, but it also means government. Isn't that interesting? Okay, the Reichstag was a building where the government was housed. Reichspartei means government party, political party, and that was the day of their political party, 1927, the Nazi Party. Nazi was short for Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, National Socialist German Workers' Party. Almost sounds communist, doesn't it? But it was labeled fascist. Really, it was socialist. Adolf Hitler nimmt den Vorbeimarsch der SA und SS ab vor dem Führer Hauptmann Pfeffer. So there's Hauptmann, which means general, Pfeffer, which means pepper. I wonder if he was ever a sergeant, Sergeant Pepper. Anyway, he's General Pepper here. Okay. Dem Führer Hauptmann. Hauptmann, of course, means general. Hauptmannführer is a high general, okay? See all the medals this guy's wearing? They love to show off their medals. See what he's got on right here, Hitler? The Iron Cross. And here you see it on General Pfeffer. They were very, very proud people. And so that's a little parade that's taking place there. So he gained control of the country, made the speeches, got people all stirred up that Germany could rise to great power and strength. Sure enough, it did. It had to get big enough to threaten not only all of Europe, but the entire world. In the meantime, there was another little repulsive character in Italy named Benito Mussolini. Benito Mussolini started a party, and he called it Fascisti, or Fascisti. That was the name of his party. From that you get the word fascist. Now, I'm going to surprise you a little bit. Does anybody here know what fascist, not what it is now, but the meaning of the word itself? You think you know the meaning of the word? Yeah, my wife knows. A bundle of sticks. In other words, a united bundle of sticks tied together. And incidentally, do you know what we have in our Supreme Court building? Do you know what we have in a lot of our big federal buildings in Washington, D.C.? We've got the symbol for fascism, a bundle of sticks. It used to be on our 10-cent piece. Remember that? Didn't it have an axe in it too? But it had a whole bunch of sticks, and it was bundled together of all ways. It had like a band around it and a diagonal piece coming down to another band. That is called a helix, and that's an occult symbol. So we have the symbol for fascism, which was the same symbol used by Mussolini, right over here. See, it's all the same club, isn't it? When you're dealing with Illuminism, with a conspiracy, you've got people that institute their symbols wherever their presence is made known, whether it be in this country or any other country. Okay? Now, I'm not trying to take away from the nationalism, the pride, the good things that the people, they sacrificed so much. And the American people at that time were very, very giving, and they didn't realize what was going on, who was behind all of this. So when we come against this sort of thing, we have to qualify that it's a relatively small group of people at the top that were engineering all of this and used the people. The people were, many of them, martyrs, and many died Many people sent their sons off to war and they never came home. Sons and husbands, a terrible thing. These people paid a great price and did a remarkable job. But it's just that the power behind all of this was very evil, making this happen. Now, so there they were, and of course he had other members of his, you don't want to call them cabinet members of his little party that he engineered. Goering, Goebbels, Hess, numerous others that I don't have time to do profiles on. Here's a little better picture of him. You'll notice there's something missing from all those faces. Don't they look awful? Yeah, they do. They actually have a similar face to what you see in these rock star albums. These rap music and rock music stuff. Yeah. Because there is a spirit there. Now understand something else about Hitler. After he started killing the Jews, after he opened these concentration camps and did all this stuff, there was one man who came to his defense when he was criticized. And people got somewhat upset about it at the time, but it was quickly forgotten. The man who came to his defense was Pope Pius XII, who said Adolf Hitler is the defender of the faith. He was a strict Roman Catholic. In addition to that, oh, by the way, there was a man who worked for the Third Reich. So I'm going to tell you some things you won't get in the history books, okay? I guarantee you wouldn't get this in school. There was a man who worked actually for the IG Farben company, a chemical company, and they produced a gas called Zyklon B, which Zyklon means cyclone, which was really the front for the real thing. Zyklon B was not really the cyanide. It was blamed on Zyklon B. Zyklon B was a fumigant. But the cyanide pellets that were used to poison gas the Jews to death, they'd herd them into a big room, and you'd come through the shower valves, and so forth. They'd kill all these people. The company that produced that was IG Farben. The salesman who sold the poison gas pellets was the man who is now, believe it or not, Pope John Paul II, the current pope. He worked as a salesman selling poison gas pellets to the Nazi government from the IG Farben company. Okay, Shelley? Well, for a couple of reasons. The Rothschilds wanted this because, for one thing, it would divert suspicion away from themselves. For another thing, they considered it a religious sacrifice to their God, which is why it was called a Holocaust. If you look up the meaning of the word Holocaust, it is a religious sacrifice. It's not just something, it's not the same as catastrophe. I used to think it was. Look it up. It's a religious sacrifice, Holocaust. So it was the Illuminists that wanted all of this bloodshed and all this murder for a number of reasons. It served the purpose. It incensed the world. It made the people in the world so angry against Germany that they were willing to fight a war against them. That anger was not there until the Jews started to be murdered. Then the anger began to well up as the reports began to flood the earth. Okay? Sure. Yeah, they have no concern at all for their racial brethren. As long as, they're cannon fodder. As long as they get their way. Who would ever suspect the Rothschilds were financing Hitler when Hitler was killing the Jews and Rothschild was the champion of all the Jews? Who would suspect it? But this is the nature of Illuminism. It's nothing new. We have little shades of this stuff going on all the time. You know what's really interesting too? The president we've got right now is saying that the National Rifle Association or anybody else has no right to criticize the police or any law enforcement people in this country, when Bill Clinton himself, a number of years ago, if you go back to the 60s, was rabble-rousing and was a cop hater and hated everything. The hypocrisy is amazing. Okay? We'll get to that in current events. Anyway, so here was Hitler. Now it was time to start a war. How did Hitler do it? Hitler got on the radio. He could speak very good English, by the way. And another thing that he did do was he was an avid follower of astrology. He had an entire battery of astrologers that he consulted with all the time for advice. People and German people all over in these other areas, such as the Alsace-Lorraine, the Sudetenland, and all of these peripheral areas around Germany. He said because German people live there, that land belongs to Germany. So really, he was for peace. A piece of Czechoslovakia, a piece of France, a piece of Austria, okay? As the old joke went. But Chamberlain came, Neville Chamberlain, and they had some discussions and some talks, and it seemed like everything was going pretty well. And all of a sudden, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, which is down near Czechoslovakia, down in that area, and he got it. But suddenly, unexpectedly, in 1939, he attacked Poland with something called a blitzkrieg. The word blitzkrieg means lightning war. Krieg means war. Actually pronounced Krieg. It ends with a G, so it's pronounced like a K. Lightning war, blitzkrieg. They came into Poland, but here's something you need to know that you won't get in the history books either. There was another man who helped Hitler take Poland. There was another army that came in from the east, and Hitler came in from the west. It was Stalin of the Soviet Union, and Stalin was never blamed for it. Hitler was. Stalin was equally guilty. Unprovoked, they attacked Poland and butchered countless thousands of people. But all you read about in the paper is this awful Hitler. In fact, there were all kinds of propaganda-type songs written to really make Hitler look all the worse. Not that he really needed to be made to look worse. He was looking pretty bad. You know what I mean? But they would have these songs. Entertainers begin to make songs like Spike Jones and his band had Der Führer's Face. And it was a spoof on Hitler. Then there was the other one, Stalin wasn't Stalin. See, when Hitler and Stalin were working together, Hitler turned against Stalin and attacked Russia in something called the Wehrmacht. And Hitler could not take Russia because the landmass was so big. Here, let's move ahead. Here we go. European theater. A theater of war. Okay. Question? Really, what got the war going was the attack on Poland. There was a lot of provocation on Hitler's part of taking these other lands. The Tyrolean land, the Alsace-Lorraine, the Saar region, all along the borders of France, Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, and Poland, between Poland and not far from Berlin, actually. Well, let's see if I can find it on here. I don't think it shows it on here, but there was, see this border with Germany here? There was a corridor set up in the Versailles Treaty that Germany could not cross. It was called the Danzig Corridor. And what Hitler did is he said, look, I'm going to take all this stuff and I'm just going to move in. It was, what really got the war rolling was on September 1st through the 28th, 1939, as it shows on the map there, the attack on Poland. You'll notice it doesn't show Russia attacking Poland. It shows Russia being invaded, but Russia invaded Poland. It's not in any of the history books. But it has been recorded by independent scholars who have studied this. Okay? But none of the school books have it. None of the universities teach it. You almost have to go to libraries and dig this stuff out. Okay? So anyway, Hitler decided to turn against Russia. Now, he was winning everywhere. Hitler took France. Italy, of course, was on his side. He sent Erwin Rommel, down into northern Africa with the Panzer Division, and there he fought against Patton. Later on, Patton's Third Army was moved up to the north along with Montgomery's Eighth Army. But this whole thing was going on. Hitler was winning everywhere he went. Massive victories for the Third Reich. Up into the Netherlands in 1940, April, let's see once, where are we here? Netherlands, May 10th through the 15th, 1940. Denmark, April 9th, 1940. Up into Norway, April 9th through June 9th, 1940. Every place they went, they won. Until Hitler said, I am going to take Russia. I'm going to turn against Stalin. He said to his astrologers, what should I do? They said, don't go to Russia, you'll lose. He said, I'm going anyway. He had his astrologers all killed and got a new bunch in and said, now, should I go to Russia? They said, oh yeah, you should go to Russia. They weren't stupid. Okay? As soon as Hitler attacked Poland, France and England simultaneously declared war, almost simultaneously declared war on Germany. The United States was not in the war yet. This was 1939. The United States didn't enter until 1941 with the Japanese attack in Pearl Harbor. Incidentally, Hitler had another ally, Hirohito of Japan, with his Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. So he had Japan and the Pacific helping him. They weren't much help, but they were a diversion. They kept other people busy. And incidentally, Russia, that big, massive Russia, this surprises people too. Russia, after Hitler attacked them, became our ally in the West, and the same country, Russia, was our enemy in the East, shooting down our planes in the East and helping us in the West, same country. And after the war was over, in 1946, we gave the Russian soldiers, I don't recall how many millions of dollars it was in scrip money, which we redeemed in gold. We put the Russian army on U.S. payroll while they came in and took over all of Eastern Europe and set it up under communism. That was paid for by U.S. taxpayers. Not a pretty thing, is it? So Hitler was winning everywhere until he went into Russia. And there he was stopped by the Russian winter and the massive expanse of land he had to try to cross. He could not do it. And of course the propaganda songs rolled on. Did you ever hear that song, Stalin Wasn't Stalin? I'm sure that's an old World War II song. Well, now Stalin wasn't Stalin when he told the beast of Berlin he'd never rest content until he had driven him from the land. So they called the Yanks in English and proceeded to extinguish the Fuhrer and his vermin. That's how it all began. They play this on the radio, you know. See if I can remember the words. Then they had a talking session in it. Now the devil, he was reading in the good book one day, how the Lord created Adam to walk the righteous way. And it made the devil jealous. He turned green up to his horns, and he swore by things unholy he'd make one of his own. So he packed 2 suitcases full of grief and misery and caught the midnight special going down to Germany. Then he mixed his lies and hatred with fire and brimstone. Then the devil sat upon it. That's how Adolf was born. Now Adolf got the notion that he was the master race, and he swore by things unholy that, I got mixed up. That he was the master race. Oh, where does it go from there? And he swore he'd bring new order and put mankind in his place. So he set his scheme in motion and was winning everywhere, till he up and got the notion for to kick that Russian bear. And so then they go through it again. Stalin wasn't Stalin when he told the beast of Berlin he'd never rest content until he had driven him from the land. So he called the Yanks in English and proceeded to extinguish the Fuhrer and his vermin. That's how it all began. It's quite a song. They used to play that on the radio. Anyway, so the war moved on and on. Battles were fought back and forth. And finally, the United States entered the war in 1941. And I'll show you how that happened in a couple of minutes. But After the U.S. entered the war, everything began to change because in this country, everything started to gear up for war production, which really boosted the economy too. Everybody went to work in the factories. There had been a Great Depression in this country, but now everybody had jobs. I remember my dad saying he used to work sometimes 16 hours a day for 27 cents an hour. And they were making trucks for the military, four-wheel drive company. And everybody was put to work. Women went to work on the riveting lines in the factories. And by the way, that really changed things too. That's the first time women really ever walked out on their children and went to the factories. You know what? They never came back. World War II did that to us also. It liberated the women so they could go out in the workforce. Okay? Now, see, up until that time, they stayed home and made donuts and cookies and sewed clothes and brought their children up. Starting in World War II, it changed. Right. But see, they looked at it that now they could be like a man. Now they could put pants on like a man and go work in the factory. And you know what happened when they put the pants on and went to work in the factories? They started talking like men, walking like men, acting like men, got masculinized. Yeah, they started to smoke and even chew. Yeah. And later on, and what did the men do? They got wimpier. They got feminine. See, everything got all messed up. Okay? Like the rock song, walk like a man, talk like a man. So anyway, enough of that. So the war continued on. Now, on June the 6th, 1944, I'm jumping ahead here because we didn't get to Japan yet. But on June 6, 1944, Normandy was invaded. Does anybody know what that famous battle was called? June 6th, Normandy. Think about it. It was a major turning point in the war when the Allies landed at Normandy. No. When I tell you, you'll kick yourself. You'll kick yourself. It was D-Day. Wouldn't you just like to kick yourself? D-Day. Okay. All right. Yeah, you're thinking, Brother Mick, you're thinking of the Battle of the Bulge. That was actually a winter battle, December 16th through the 27th. That was one of the last-ditch efforts of the Nazis to try to break through. See, the United States had to land, along with the other allies. They had to land in Normandy to get into France, because France had fallen. When Hitler took France, he went and stood in the Arc de Triomphe and did a victory jig. There's a famous picture of him doing that. But anyway, here you have the landing at Normandy. And of course, great battles then were fought in here. All over in France. They are all dated on here. And finally, a line was drawn as the Allies tried to move toward Germany. Okay? You had two armies, basically. You had, well, first of all, you had Montgomery's 8th Army, and he was a British general. And you had General Patton, who had set up a front. But behind him, of course, was Eisenhower, who rode around all over the area in a train car. Ran the war from there. Now, another little thing that a lot of people don't realize is Hitler tried to surrender in 1943, late 1943, because they had basically run out of fuel. See, the Third Reich, as it was called, the Nazi Empire, was supplied with fuel by Rockefeller, Standard Oil Company of Venezuela. The Maracaibo oil fields provided 85% of all the fuel for the Third Reich. In other words, it was sent over there from here, basically from an American company. Rockefeller, Standard Oil. You expect more from Standard, and you get it. Okay? Without that fuel, you couldn't have had World War II. So just think of that. Just think how awful that was. Of course, I've talked to Vietnam veterans who said they saw Standard Oil trucks coming out of Hanoi supplying both sides. So, as I said, we don't have wars, we have theaters of war. Okay, just a lot of people get caught up in the bloodshed and carnage, that's all. So, you have those two armies. Eisenhower is back there. Here's a little something that generally isn't taught either. And I verified this. Hitler tried to surrender, but it wasn't time yet. The bombers hadn't done their job yet. They had to destroy Germany so American companies could come in and rebuild it. See, when the military generals pull out, the real generals come in. General Electric, General Dynamics, and all the other generals. See, they all have to come in, take over. It's called an urban renewal project. You go in, you wipe out a country, you send your people in, build up the factories, put in puppet managers, but then you really own them. Okay, Shelley? There were a lot of purposes for it. To bring about the UN, to take over these other countries, to expand communism. There were quite a number of objectives, and they got all of them accomplished. Okay? Does everybody kind of get a picture of what's going on here? Now, when the Third Reich was trying to surrender, the surrender wasn't accepted. Patton was ready to move in. Okay, can we stop tapping here? Okay. Patton was ready to move in to Germany, accept the surrender, and actually just occupy and end the war. And he was going to do it, and Eisenhower cut off his supply line. See, every army has a supply line. As you move up to a front, you have to have a supply line feeding that front. Eisenhower said, no, we don't want to end the war yet. Can you imagine that? So Patton turned around and attacked Eisenhower, which is why they ran him over with a jeep at the end of the war, before the story could be made known. But Patton attacked and got his own supplies, but then Patton, if you recall, was given an order by the president to stop immediately. Do you know your history? Now, of course, you know I'm a locksmith. I verified this. I think the Lord allows me to run into these situations. But I was over at the American Legion building in Horicon, and they wanted a lock put on. That's why they'd called me. So I was putting the lock in, and there was this old veteran sitting there at the table drinking a beer, as veterans do, you know. A lot of other people do too. I said to him, I was putting the lock in. I got talking. I said, you look like you probably were in World War II. He had his little hat on, and real proud. He said, oh, yes, I was. I said, well, Europe or the Pacific? He said, Europe. I said, oh. I said, what did you do in Europe? He said, well, it just so happens that I flew around a lot. He said, I was General Patton's pilot, his personal pilot. I said, oh, really? I said, tell me something. I heard that at one point in the war, Patton attacked Eisenhower. And he set his beer down on the table and he looked at me. He said, how did you know that? I said, well, I'd heard that. And he said, that's right. Then he said, you should come over to my house sometime, we can talk. And I called him, and he didn't want to talk anymore. The word has just never gotten out. The war could have ended in 1943. But the powers that were there did not want it to end. It wasn't time yet. The bulldozers, called B-52s and other planes, had not done their job yet of devastating Germany. They had to bomb the daylights out of it so they could come in and take over and rebuild it and own it. Okay? See, the conspirators had built up Russia at one time. They put factories in Russia, but nothing came out of the factories because people didn't want to. They were agricultural people. It was a big disappointment. They tried to develop Russia, and Russia couldn't be developed. So they thought to themselves, where are the two most industrious places in the world where we could make some real money? And they found it was Germany and Japan. If they could come in and bomb the daylights out of Germany and out of Japan and then rebuild, they'd have ownership. That's why in Japan, General Motors, Chrysler Corporation, Ford Motor Company, all own controlling stock in Nissan, Mitsubishi, and all the others. They have Japanese running the companies, but they don't own them. And they're supposed to be the competition. Who rebuilt Japan anyway? After it was bombed almost out of existence. 80% destruction by incendiary bombs. The people didn't even have soap for 3 months. They had nothing. Did they rebuild their country from nothing? No. We had something called the Marshall Plan. I'll get into that later, okay? How the what? Well, the only way the United States got involved overtly in the war was as a result of Pearl Harbor. Yeah, I was going to come to the Japanese thing. Because the United States didn't... See, I moved ahead in Europe here because the war was being fought in both theaters at the same time. The United States entered in 1941. Here you've got in 1944 Normandy. And then in December of 44, the Battle of the Bulge, which was a last effort on Germany's part, major effort, to try to crack the line between Montgomery's 8th and Patton's 3rd Army. The Battle of the Bulge fought here was to break that line in half and flank it and move both directions and break that line. And they almost did it. Okay, so all of this happened later. But something happened in 1941. We'll have to go to that in order to understand any of the rest of this, and we're running real short on time. The attack on Pearl Harbor. Quite a subject. Roosevelt, the president, wanted to get the United States into the war. But you can't just enter the war. You've got to have an excuse to enter it. The people would never stand for it. Congress would have to declare war. And they weren't about to. Roosevelt ran on the ticket, re-elect the man that'll keep your sons out of the war. Do you remember another president who used the same slogan? Woodrow Wilson, the same exact thing. Re-elect the man that'll keep your sons out of the war. And at that same time, he was planning to get the United States into the war. Okay, now, Japan had a lot of resentment against the United States, but the United States had provoked Japan repeatedly. A lot of people don't realize we blockaded Japan so that we restricted their shipping traffic. In addition to that, we had the Lend-Lease agreement where we were supplying the Allied forces without cost all kinds of munitions and supplies, which is considered an act of war. So really it was the United States was really in the war in 1943 as far as supplying the other nations. Okay? But on December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor was hit by a sneak attack, as it was called. I have a report at home that it just was sent to me by an organization, really a one-man organization, you might say, but this man published a book, Hartford Van Dyke, a Dutch man, by the way. That makes it authentic, see? But Hartford Van Dyke wrote a book because his father was stationed at Pearl Harbor. In fact, his father actually buried quite a number of people. He saw the whole thing, and he told the whole horrifying story. Of course, we know that the code had been cracked, the Japanese code had been cracked. for several weeks before Pearl Harbor. We knew they were going to attack. We knew where, from what direction. We knew what time they were going to attack to the very minute. We knew there would be 33 warships sent out, and there would be 360 Mitsubishi A6M Japanese Zero fighters, fighter bombers that would come in. Okay? We knew all that. So Admiral Kimmel, who was in charge of Pearl Harbor, was to receive a message from the War Department. James Vincent Forrestal, the Undersecretary of the Navy, who had all the information, went to Roosevelt and said, look, there's an attack coming. Let's get the word to Admiral Kimmel. Admiral Kimmel didn't hear anything from Roosevelt until the bombs were falling. He did get an advance notice to watch out for Japanese sabotage. The preparation for sabotage and an attack are exactly opposite of each other. Furthermore, orders were given to make sure that all the planes on the ground, the United States warplanes, would have their fuel tanks half full. You know why? A full fuel tank won't explode. When it's half full, it'll always explode. There are a lot of things going on. Forrestal was suddenly arrested, couldn't figure out what was going on. Roosevelt ordered Forrestal arrested and locked in a room until after the attack, so he couldn't possibly warn Admiral Kimmel. After these 33 Japanese ships got close enough, and of course their code word was climb Mount Nataka, and the planes came flying in and did all the damage and all the bombing. The Arizona went down, other ships went down. These men, over 2,100 of them, trapped in the bulkheads of these ships, were banging on the metal, trying to let people know we're alive, get us out. Roosevelt gave strict orders, no rescues. Don't attempt any rescues. Commander-in-Chief. These men kept diaries for days down there until they finally suffocated. And they wrote in there, we can't understand why they're not rescuing us. We know they can hear us. And those diaries are still in existence in safe hands. See, Roosevelt had to have enough dead bodies to make the American people mad enough against the Japanese to incite the war against them. That's what happened. Okay? Comments, questions? We're almost out of time. We're going to quit in 4 minutes here. So Americans were signing up everywhere to go and fight the Japanese. Do you have a question, Shirley? I'm going to probably have to wrap this up next week, just some details on it. But well, it's pretty hard to teach World War II in an hour and a half. Shelley's probably thinking, well, let's have a few more sessions. But what were you going to say? The Japanese were allied with Germany, but they weren't really doing anything. Okay? With Germany, just Mussolini and the Italians and the Germans and the Japanese, and I think Bulgaria, which meant nothing. Really meant nothing. Well, they had been working with Hitler, but they weren't doing anything at all. They weren't involved. They weren't shipping anything to Hitler. They were just basically sitting there, waiting in the wings. But they committed no war crimes. They did nothing. They were in agreement with Hitler, but they were totally inactive. Okay? That's basically what was happening. They were starting, once Pearl Harbor took place, they were ready. They immediately started to take over all the islands in the Pacific. Here we go. Oops, I better turn that around. Yeah, Pearl Harbor really got things going, that's correct. All of these different islands, New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Marshall Islands, Gilbert Islands, Mariana Islands, Guam, Midway, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, all these different islands. And of course, the Americans were so outraged over that attack that many of the young men just went right down and signed up. They wanted to fight the Japanese. One such man was one of my uncles who came back without a kneecap. Stepped on a mine. So I've got another one that was actually in the European theater. And when he was over there, his platoon was caught in a situation where there was a machine gun nest, and nobody wanted to volunteer to take it out. The only way to take it out was with a grenade. So there's a German machine gun nest. So my uncle, not the one this is a different one now. Not the one that was fighting over in the Pacific. His name was David Meyer, but he volunteered. Under heavy fire, he took a grenade and his rifle and crawled 100 yards, if you can imagine. Near enough to the machine gun nest to take it out. He pulled the pin, flipped the grenade out, wiped out the machine gun nest, but he was hit with shrapnel. And one piece of that shrapnel lodged in his liver. They had to do surgery on him. And it was 12 years later, it turned to cancer. And that's what eventually killed him. So he died from old wounds. But as a result of what he did in saving that platoon, they gave him a battlefield commission. And he became he was an enlisted man. He went from private to second lieutenant on the battlefield. Then after the war, he left the Army and joined the Air Force with the rank of lieutenant colonel. But then his old wounds killed him. So he was always my favorite uncle, too. He always bought me presents, came to see me, So anyway, and he'd tell me about, that's how I know some of these things, just from listening and learning. Anyway, there's no better way to learn than talk to people who are right there. Then you got real history, because they were there. So all these young men went off, and I'll give you another little song here. They went off to fight the Japanese, okay? This was a real popular one that was circulating right after Pearl Harbor. Goodbye, Mama, I'm off to Yokohama for my red, white, and blue, my country and you. Goodbye, Mama, I'm off to Yokohama just to teach all those Japs the Yanks are no saps. A million fighting sons of Uncle Sam, if you please. We'll soon have all those Japs right down on their Japanese. So goodbye, Mama, I'm off to Yokohama for my country, my flag, and you. They'd sing that, Anyway. So this was a whole different theater of war over here, and there's a lot to tell about that, and I always bite off more than I can chew. And it is 8:30. I want to keep my promise here and stop. So I think what I'm going to do next time is finish up World War II and move into the Korean War into the 50s. And then in the last session, we'll try to, which is right after Labor Day, that Tuesday after Labor Day, Memorial Day, we will go from the 60s revolution, Vietnam and the 60s revolution, and up into some current events, and we'll end there. So at the end of this month, we'll be through. So 2 more sessions. And I just have a little more to say about World War II, the Japanese involvement and so forth. Into Korea, we got to talk about MacArthur, all that kind of stuff, and on into the 50s with Eisenhower and all that. We'll talk about the atomic bomb and lots of interesting stuff. Any final comments or questions? Hope you didn't mind the singing. Huh? Oh, Rosie the Riveter? Yeah, that was another one. Uh-huh. Yep. Oh, yeah, there were all kinds of them. Right. See, you want to turn the lights on? See, actually, the thing to remember about even some of these generals, like Patton actually thought he was supposed to win the war. You know? He figured the sooner the better. He didn't know that they had to drag this thing out. You see, Stanton had written remember that book I told about Edwin Stanton? He said you have to have war for 4 years to break a country. 1941, 42, 43, it was too soon, wasn't it? You had to go to 44, 45. Okay? That's what it took to break the country and be able to take over. But yeah, a lot of these generals thought, hey, we're supposed to win. You know? Okay, Shelley? Yeah, that was Patton. They ran him over. Of course, they made it look like an accident. They couldn't get anybody to just go and shoot him. That'd be too obvious. It had to look like an accident. Of course, I'll tell you about Yalta, too, next week. The meeting between Roosevelt and Stalin and Churchill. Did you know that Stalin secretly had microfilm pictures and recordings of the Yalta thing, and that Roosevelt conspired to hand over Eastern Europe and the Balkans to Stalin? That it was Roosevelt's idea to further communism? See, Roosevelt was communist. And those microfilms got into the hands of Senator Arthur Vandenberg. I have a copy of the book where he tells the story. It's real hard to find. I found it at a Goodwill store. You don't find it in libraries. They pulled that one. That's history they don't want you to know about. Arthur Vandenberg was going to make this known. And they thought Roosevelt is going to talk. He's going to leak this out. We're going to have to get rid of him. So he was down getting his picture painted in Warm Springs, Georgia, the little White House. And the person painting the picture took out a gun and blew off the top of his head. Killed him. Now, word got out the president is dead. He died of a massive cerebral hemorrhage. And of course, a bullet in the head will do that. They just didn't tell you how he got that massive cerebral hemorrhage. But they took him out, and then Truman took over before the war ended. And Truman is the one who gave the orders for the Enola Gay to be sent over and to drop that atomic bomb both in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But that's okay. We'll come back to that. Okay. Truman said he would have, but it was doubtful. It's hard to say. Yeah, but that's different. You got to understand that. I want you to see the difference on that. Okay, if you're Roosevelt and you're before the public and you've got this image as a great humanitarian, a great liberal lover of people and all this kind of stuff, and then you incite the Japanese, but nobody knows you did it. It looks like the Japanese were the aggressors, and they came and they got you and did you in. And you're just retaliating in righteous indignation. That's one thing. But for you to give orders to go over and drop these bombs and kill all these little children and all these women and all these common people and wipe these cities out, that would give him quite a different image. Sure. Works the same in any country, as Goering said. Works the same in any country. Well, let's pray here. Yep. Billy Graham said he'd make a wonderful evangelist.